This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ESG competition webinar for project applicants within the North Carolina Balance of State, CoC. This webinar is hosted specifically by the North Carolina Balance of State, CoC, for project applicants interested in applying for calendar year 2023 ESG annual allocation funds. My name is Laurel McNamee. I am a project specialist with the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness and help staff the North Carolina Balance of State, CoC. This is not a webinar hosted by the ESG office of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, although I will be giving you information on how to join those webinars during this one. So welcome. Again, this webinar is for project applicants interested in applying, either new applicants or returning applicants for ESG funds for calendar year 2023. And let me give you a hint of our agenda for what we were going to be doing today. Because I am not sure who's in the room, there may be folks who have applied for and had ESG funds for many years, and there may be some brand new folks here. We are going to spend some time starting out doing an overview of what the ESG process is and what the competition process is within the Balance of State and more broadly within the ESG office or the state of North Carolina. We are then going to go into the questions I'm sure you're all wondering. How much money is available? What is the timeline for this competition? I have updates for you, especially for those folks who are coming back, returning applicants, on changes to the project application scorecard and how that's going to impact how your information is reviewed this year. We're going to go over in detail the project application instructions and where to find them and what kind of valuable information is on them. We are then going to go in detail over the required materials that you will be asked to submit with your packet to the North Carolina Balance of State, CoC. And if I can get through all of that and still have a voice, we'll do some quick Q&A after that. All right. So first to begin, and welcome especially if there are folks who have never applied for ESG funds here before. We want to make sure we are not just jumping far ahead of you and leaving you behind. So I want to make sure we get a chance to do an overview of what is ESG, what is this competition, and what is this source of funding. So to start broadly, the ESG stands for the Emergency Solutions Grant. It is a source of funding that is whose purpose is to provide assistance to rapidly rehouse persons who are currently experiencing homelessness. But it is the target of the way that it does this is to assist in meeting the costs of operating emergency shelters and decreasing homelessness through the prevention of preventive programs and activities. As you will notice through all ESG language, there is an emphasis on permanent housing and rehousing folks who are experiencing homelessness. It is important to know that A, Laurel, and B, NCCUH, and C, the ESG office do not set the priorities for the ESG program. The priorities for this grant fund come from HUD itself, as does the money where it originates. Those priorities from HUD are to broaden the existing emergency shelter and homelessness prevention activities, to emphasize, there it is again, rapid rehousing, and help people quickly regain stability in permanent housing after experiencing a housing crisis and or homelessness. For every activity type, you're going to hear me sort of interchangeably talk about which project you're applying for and the activity type. Those terms are sort of interchangeable. So just note that for every activity type, meaning emergency shelter activities or street outreach activities, ESG funding should be assisting people to access and maintain permanent housing. We know that shelter services, street outreach services save lives, but that housing is what ends homelessness, and that these funds should be targeted towards that end. There are 5 eligible components or activity types under ESG, and they are broken broadly into 2 categories. There is an emergency response category, which is street outreach and emergency shelter programs and services. And then there is housing stability, and this covers rapid rehousing programs and homelessness prevention programs. The 5th is HMIS, which is the Homelessness Management Information System, the database that is used for all of these programs to help coordinate, track, and provide excellent services. Okay. So there are some key eligibility requirements for ESG subrecipients. And what I mean by a subrecipient is someone who operates the services that ESG funds are supporting. So the emergency shelter, the agency that operates the emergency shelter will be the subrecipient for ESG funds. That agency or subrecipient must be a 501c3 or a unit of local government, but public housing authorities are not eligible for ESG funds. You cannot use ESG funds to fund transitional housing programs. If you're not sure the difference between a transitional housing program and an emergency shelter, well, that's a good question. I can tell you more about it, but if you have folks that are staying in your program over a year, up to 2 years, if you are collecting income from folks to be able to guarantee their stay there, if they are signing lease type agreements, you have a transitional housing program. And we are in the ESG program funds emergency shelter programs to quickly, quickly support people in accessing permanent housing, not transitional housing. ESG funds cannot be used for, so let's keep the emergency shelter example going. You can't use ESG funds for capital improvement projects, such as like new construction or retail acquisition. However, you can use it for maintenance of your current and existing program space. I want to make sure to put a couple links in here. Oops. If there's anyone on my staff that has access to these links and can put them in the chat, I'm not able to really do it through PowerPoint. So if not, please, I will distribute these slides later. Please come back to these. There is important information. If you're having questions about, but specifically, what can I spend this money on? If you are already at that point in your planning, I would encourage you to visit the HUD's interim rule on ESG funding, as well as the North Carolina ESG office's desk guide. Those really get into the details on what can and cannot be funded with ESG funds. Okay, here is the way zoomed out version of the flow of ESG funds. I only put this on here to demonstrate that the ESG funding through the this Emergency Solutions Grant Program does originate with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. There are some communities, usually metropolitan areas, that do get, they're called entitlement communities, that get ESG funds directly from HUD. There are none in the balance of states. So I'm really only placing this for context so that you can see how the money gets to you from HUD. So for agencies like y'all, ESG funds come from HUD through the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. who is the recipient of ESG funds, which is why agencies are then called sub-recipients. So the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services is essentially subcontracting with all of you all for funds that come through HUD. Okay, here's my very messy triangle. Some of y'all have already seen this. This is a way to try to capture a bit of a visual around the flow of the ESG application process. And the reason I have this is to show you that the way that the competition flows, what is required from the ESG office is that the CoC, that the North Carolina Balance of State CoC submits one regional application for funding, for the total amount that it may be eligible to the CoC. It is up to the CoC to facilitate its own internal competition to determine which agencies will be funded with that money and at what amount. So it is on the Balance of State to host an internal competition, decide who is approved for funding at what amount, and then create a regional application with all of those dollar amounts and send that to the ESG office. That's the outside part of the triangle. Then the ESG office contracts directly with you. You do not contract with the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness. There's no contract with the Balance of State CoC. It is through the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services ESG office, which is part of Division of Aging and Adult Services. So that's the outside piece of the triangle. The inside piece is that there is then an extra step for you all as agencies. If you are approved through the localized competition for the Balance of State CoC, you'll be given notice, and then you will need to submit your agency's application to the ESG office directly by their final deadline. Remember that this competition is for the Balance of State CoC, which is 79 counties of North Carolina. Okay, nobody should put me in charge of making flow charts. Oh, someone cleaned up my arrows. Oh, I'm so grateful. My arrows looked a lot messier, but thank you to whoever did that. Here is a little bit of a flow chart for the process that you all are going to go through for submitting applications. So from the perspective of an agency, this is a flow chart talking about what will happen through the ESG competition. So you are charged with submitting your project application with all the appropriate supplemental materials to NCCEH, my office, by August the 12th, 2022. That application will then be reviewed by NCCEH staff and the North Carolina Balance of State CoC's Project Review Committee. So if then following the top here, that review process is then recommended, it will be, looks like we have a typo here. So if you, it will be voted on and approved by the steering committee, the governing body for the Balance of State CoC, at which point you will be given notice to perhaps adjust your application. You'll be given feedback as well as whether that you're approved, and potentially you may need to adjust the dollar amounts, some language in your application. You will then have a window of time to turn that around, incorporate that feedback, get the correct dollar amount that you're approved for, and then submit all of those documentation to the ESG office, okay? So that's the top line up here, tracking this way. If your application is denied by the steering committee, you have the option to submit an appeal. It's a window of time. There are specific requirements for which an appeal will be heard. And if that the project, if we get appeals, the project review committee will be convened again to review that. And if the project review committee recommends considering that appeal, it will go back in front of the steering committee. The steering committee then once again may approve you, overturning the previous denial, at which point you will be able to once again make adjustments to your application based on that feedback and submit all documentation to the ESG office. If the appeal is denied by either the project review committee or the steering committee, the process has been ended for your agency for this year, and you will be given feedback either way. Okay, it's important to know that once again, the Balance of State CoC, it covers 79 counties of North Carolina. The CoC is then broken into 13 regions. The ESG office divides the total amount available to the Balance of State according to those 13 regions. So each region has what's called a fair share that you can apply for and no more. Doing this ensures that funds do not get concentrated in one part of the state or among larger agencies. However, it does mean if there is any money left unallocated from a region at the end of the competition, that money goes back to the North Carolina ESG office without a guarantee that it's going to be even applied within the Balance of State. So it is important, and we encourage all of you throughout all 13 regions of the Balance of State to really be applying for what you need, but also to be sharing this information with other providers in the region so that you all can maximize the amount of money that's available to you, because it is available to you and the regions in your the counties in your immediate vicinity. So it's important to work together to get the word out, to encourage each other, and try to maximize that fair share in each region. Now, within each region and within each regional fair share, the money is split up in what's called a 60-40 split. So this refers to the mandatory distribution of funds. Now, remember we talked about the 5 component types for ESG funding that are broken into 2 broader categories. So the 60-40 split is referring to those 2 broader categories, the emergency response activities and housing stability activities or projects. So remember that emergency response projects are emergency shelters and street outreach programs, and housing stabilization services are rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention programs. So there is a 40% minimum of a regional fair share that must be allocated to housing stability services. So with the total amount that is available to your region, at least 40% of that must go to rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention. It could be the entire amount. If there is only a rapid rehousing program in your area, they could apply for the entire regional fair share. But at least 40% of that regional fair share must go to those types of projects, and a maximum of 60% of the regional fair share may be allocated to those crisis response services or emergency response services like street outreach and emergency shelter. So why do that? I mean, it's not something we set, but it does continue to really prioritize finding permanent housing and not just serving people that are experiencing homelessness, the like 3 hots and a cot thing, but really working towards finding solutions and finding housing for people who are experiencing a crisis. It's also worth noting that rapid rehousing programs require a lot of funding because housing, as you all know, is increasingly hard to come by and increasingly expensive. So, you know, it's just worth noting that if there is one rapid rehousing provider in your region and a lot of emergency shelters, it might look like there is, you know, that rapid rehousing program is able to walk away with a bigger amount of money than each emergency shelter. And that is true, but that's because of this 60-40 split. And that's not to say that a rapid rehousing program is guaranteed funding just because there isn't another rapid rehousing program. They need to submit quality applications. Okay, so then from your program budget aspect, there is also a 60-40 split that you need to pay attention when you put together your budget for this application. There's a 60-40 split that exists within each program budget for the use of ESG funds. For those of y'all that are in emergency shelters, there is a maximum of 40% that can be spent on services. So ESG funds breaks down, your budget form will break down into services and operations. So remember that a 40% max of your funds can be spent on services. And there is not a limit that you can spend on operations. With rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, there is also a 40% max that can be spent on services, but there is no limit to what you can spend on financial assistance. It's worth noting that street outreach programs are almost entirely services. There's not like a facility to operate typically. So there's no cap or restrictions on that. Can I explain the services? Yes, so services are going to be like your case management services. If you, let's see, wonder if we can, I'm going to be putting links in there. If you are already looking at some of the forms, you can look on the budget form itself. You will see it broken down by line item of what you can budget, including case management services, etc. And it'll group those into the operations versus services category. So I will get you those links. We're going to come to them soon, but just take a close look at your budget form when you find it. We're still speaking broadly, and worth noting that HMIS funding is an activity type. It's that 5th one. It is available for those of y'all that work in victim service providers or DV shelters. Don't take this to mean HMIS, meaning only the HMIS specific system. This funding can be used for comparable databases as well. It's really good if y'all are finding it hard to find the staff capacity or time to enter timely and good quality data. Apply for these funds. We really want to encourage folks this year. It's not an activity type that has gotten a lot of attention or funding applications in the past couple years. And we would like to encourage you to do that. Like if it helps you create capacity, and which then helps the data, helps you submit good data, that is a good thing for you. It's a good thing for the COC. It's a good thing for your region. It's good for your clients. So please take a look at that. Also worth noting that it is not part of the 60-40 split from that regional fair share. because it applies to both emergency services and housing supports. I'm mixing up those names, I'm getting them wrong. It's because it applies to everybody. Those funding applications are sort of taken off the top before the 60-40 split would kick in. So apply. Take a look for HMIS funding. If you need extra capacity, take a look at that and consider applying. Okay, give me a second. All right, so that was a bit of a broad sweeps overview. That was probably some recap for a lot of y'all, but hopefully brings everyone up into kind of a base understanding of what this grant is and what does it fund. So let's jump into a little more of specifics and let's talk about timelines. Let's talk about the money. Okay. The RFA, the request for applications, was submitted yesterday. We are having our webinar the day after the grant was published. So I'm pretty excited about that. We are trying to give you all as much time as possible to put together really quality applications. So I'm glad you're here. I am excited about the ways that we've been able to innovate this year and work with the ESG office to be able to offer you this content so quick in the competition to hopefully for the benefit of everyone. So that was released yesterday. We are here today. Now you essentially have until August 12th. Now that is not a lot of time to submit your project applications for ESG funding to NCCEH. That is that deadline is again 6 p.m. on August the 12th. That's a Friday. And don't worry, I'm going to tell you how to submit all that. But that is the deadline. Please write that down in big, bold font. The approved slate of those proposed applications is going to be considered by the steering committee on September 13th. And if you submitted an application, you will hear on the 13th whether you are approved or whether your application has been denied for funding. And then for those of you that are approved for funding, you will then have a secondary deadline to submit that project application and all the required materials directly to the ESG office by October 3rd. The reason I wanted to put all of these deadlines in front of you, just like this, these key ones, is you're going to see if you go to the ESG offices webinars and read their emails, they are only noting this October 3rd deadline. Do not take that to mean that you can submit an application for consideration anytime before October 3rd. Your deadline for inclusion in this process is August the 12th. August the 12th. August the 12th. Okay, I want to just keep saying it. And here's the timeline in a bit more detail. I don't think I quite got the instructions out on the 11th. I think it was the 12th or 13th, but it was close. The RFA was released yesterday. On your screen, you will see the ESG office is hosting 3 webinars themselves. I would encourage you, you do need to go to one of them. You are here, that is great. This again is the COC's competition. The ESG office wrote the project application, they wrote the budget form, they are making final decisions, and it is them you are contracting with. You need to understand where they are at and coming from in this competition as well. And it is essentially the relationship with the ESG office that will be your longest relationship should you get this funding, not with me. So please plan to attend one of the dates here in that third row, to the 26th, the 28th, or the 2nd. Note that the one on the 28th is for new applicants. If you have not applied or been given ESG funding before, that is the one for you. They do have registration links. They went out in an email a couple times already, but they're here as well if you need them. Once again, August the 12th, August the 12th, August the 12th is when those project applications are due to NCCEH. We will then be reviewing them the week of the 15th. The project review committee meeting will meet on the 24th. The steering committee will meet then on September 13th, and you will hear one way or the other on that day. Should you be denied, and should you meet the qualifications to submit an appeal, and should you choose to submit an appeal, those appeals will be due September 16th. Brian, I'm seeing a request for links for those ESG registration links. If you could pull those, that would be super helpful. If you don't see them in PowerPoint, they're in a recent email from them. And then again, that final deadline for agencies that have been approved to apply for ESG funding, that final application deadline is October the 3rd to the ESG office. And I think it's 5 p.m. is their time. So here is the money. The balance of state total in 79 counties has $2,531,321 available for application. That is then broken down, as we were just talking about, into these regional fair shares. So for you all, take a look, find your region. If you don't, oh, here's another link, Brian. Thank you for keeping up with me. Brian, will you also put into the chat the link for the map to the balance of state? If you all are new, very new here, and not even sure what region you're in, hopefully we can find and drop a link for the map of the state of North Carolina so that you can see which region that you're in. But the fair share amount is the total amount that can be applied for within each region. And the final columns there are the that 60-40 split that I was talking about. So the far right is the minimum amount that that needs to be applied to either rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention funding. And there's that 60% amount as a dollar amount per region for emergency services like shelters and shelters and street outreach programs. So take a look, jot those numbers down. I'll pause here and let you take a note. I did see a question in the chat. Yes, this is being recorded. This will be available on our website. I'll put the slides here too. Thank you, Brian. Okay, y'all. Let's keep moving and talk about updates. What's different this year? So this is going to be a bit more relevant for folks that have been through this before, but we've been innovating this year and we've changed some things, I think, in hope for the better, but we want to keep you up to date as to what's different. So first of all, there is an ESG funding priorities document. There had been one in the past for the balance of state CoC, but I think the last time it had been updated was 2019, and significant processes have changed for facilitating this competition since that time. So NCCH staff have worked on and have been done this in partnership with our governance committees and subcommittees, and have a new version of the funding priorities for what the CoC wants, what the priorities are for the CoC in terms of use of ESG funding. So I would encourage you to look at this just to get that broad scope of like, what does the CoC care about in terms of how it's going to help you sort of have an edge in your competition, in your application. For those of you who may have seen the document before, note that some of those particular changes that we made were shifting the process entirely from regional committees and making 13 different regional applications, so that the focus of the document was to regional committees. It is now focused on the project review committee because we have a centralized process through the CoC. There are certain things that were kind of suggested and encouraged in the 2019 version that are now matters of eligibility, including full participation with the written standards. So your program design of your program needs to be fully in compliant with the written standards of balance of state. And full participation in the coordinated entry system is also now a matter of eligibility. We are introducing a focus on performance and how your agency is doing, particularly for returning agencies. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And setting racial equity benchmarks. The Balance of State CoC decided in early 2020 to make racial equity, improving racial equity and challenging and decreasing racial disparities that do exist in every county across the CoC as a focus of the CoC. And so in line with those priorities, there are new racial equity questions and benchmarks for ESG funding as well. In terms of process, it's also important to know that your regional committees have a voice here. We did centralize the process. It was nigh unbearable in 2019 and before for folks in regional committees. So the process is now centralized, which allows a lot more capacity for folks who are on the ground in those regions. But we absolutely do not want to lose that regional perspective and voice. So we are continuing to engage regional committees for feedback on which agencies should be funded. Are there concerns at a regional level as to why an agency may not be a good fit for this funding? So they will be sent a form. Each region will be hosting a special regional committee meeting. It's going to focus on participation in those regional committee meetings and in by name list meetings. And so if you don't know A, which region you're in, or B, who your regional lead is, or C, who your coordinated entry lead is, as you are looking at applying for this funding source, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to them as quickly as possible. And I think Brian just put in the chat a link to a document on our website that can show you who those folks are and what their contact information is. We've just been doing all kinds of innovating. And so there are changes to the scorecard itself this year as well, governing how your applications will be scored. We are still finalizing it. It will be posted on our website as soon as it has been finalized. There are new sections included in the scorecard this year. There is a racial equity section. There is a performance section, and there's a community involvement section. These are all newly introduced, and Again, full adherence to the written standards is expected. There is a review of your policies and procedures. You need fully established policies and procedures documents for each program. Essentially, if you have a street outreach program and an emergency shelter program, you need a street outreach policies and procedures, and you need emergency shelter policies and procedures, and both of those need to be in accordance with the written standards document for that corresponding activity type, which you can find on the NCCEH website. And full participation in coordinated entry is also expected. We are also establishing sort of the structure and framework of the scorecard this year, and including thresholds for funding. Some of those are not only that you are an eligible program, which is what we kind of already talked about earlier in terms of being a 501c3 or unit of local government, but again, full compliance with the balance of states written standards for each activity type. If you don't know what the written standards are, or you're not sure how your policies measure up, you really need to find those on our website and read them carefully. As well as full participation in coordinated entry. So let me take a minute and then dive for a second deeper into what does that mean when I say full participation in coordinated entry, especially as a threshold component for receiving ESG funds. What am I even saying? For those emergency shelter and street outreach projects, what that full participation in coordinated entry means that you need to be administering the VI STAT, and I actually can spell out that acronym from my head, but I'm not going to because it's a terrible acronym. It is the assessment tool that assesses vulnerability for each client and helps determine what housing resources are the most appropriate. You need to then be submitting that client information to the local by name list. Typically that should be done through HMIS, but we understand that victim service providers cannot do so. So you need to follow your regionally established process for that. And you need to be attending those regional case conferencing meetings. For rapid rehousing programs and homelessness prevention programs in the balance of state, you need to be attending case conferencing meetings, and you need to be accepting all of your referrals from the by name list into your programs. You cannot be saying yes to one person who contacts you off the street and then yes or no to another person who's been referred to you through the by name list meetings. You must be taking those referrals through the by name list, through the coordinated entry process. Additionally, we're looking to even go further and establishing benchmark scores for funding eligibility, meaning we want to know and think about minimums for program design, for performance, for community involvement, in terms of what even makes an ESG application viable. We are starting to implement some of that in this year's scorecard. It is worth noting that this is going to be a baseline year for that. So as we look towards benchmarks, your renewal application might meet those, it might not. If it doesn't, we're going to be giving you feedback. This is not going to be a year where we make all those changes to these benchmarks and then just pull a bunch of people's funding because of that specific change. But note that if you are not meeting those benchmarks, that this will be kind of the banner year for you to really take that feedback into account and make a plan based on the feedback that you receive to really make sure that you are submitting a really high quality application this year, next year, the following, all of them. Again, I think Brian's already put this into our chat. All of the ESG specific stuff is going to be put at that page on our website, ncch.org/BOS/ESG. Most of the things you're going to be looking for are under a drop-down menu called Current Application. If you are looking to reference this webinar, slides, or a previous webinar, those are going to be available under an ESG webinars dropdown. So just take a look at the website and explore the dropdown menus there. Okay, we're moving right along. This is good. Let's talk about the instructions. I know I'm here, I'm talking to you, I am live or maybe not live, depending on who you are and when you're watching this. And hopefully this webinar is helpful to you. This webinar is going to tell you almost everything you need to know, but it is really, really super important that you carefully read and have at close reference your project application instructions. Oh. It looks like I'm getting a text from at least one person out in the western part of the state that's losing power due to a storm. If we have any other folks in the mountains out there, please take care of yourselves. I hope you're doing okay and can keep your internet going. So the project application instructions are a written document that is published. It is on our website. It has all of the vital information for you, and including which documents you need to submit, how you need to submit them, and when you need to submit them. So it's a very, very important piece of, I would say paper, but who prints things anymore? So please make sure you're referencing that. It has the link for where to go, the form to submit your application and all the documents you need. Everything is in the instructions. I can't emphasize that enough. It's really important to read it closely, because if you submit the application materials and you are missing one form or another, or your application is incomplete, we can't score it. So the instructions help you have something right in front of you to ensure it's got check boxes, ensure that you have all the right components to submit a really competitive application. Once again, those can be found at our website at ncceh.org/BOS/ESG, and look for the current ESG application drop-down menu. You'll find the instructions linked there. Okay, that link is in the chat as well for folks who are on the live webinar. We're doing great on time. I do still think I will hold for a Q&A session after I finish going through what's in the project application instructions and what your requirements are. But if there's something burning on your mind, please go ahead and use the chat until then. All right. So let's dig in to the what. We've covered the when, we've covered the how much, we've covered what are you applying for. So what do you need to submit in order to be considered for this funding? This year is different. For returning applicants, this is especially important for you to know. This year is different. The ESG office has made changes, the most notable of which is that their project applicant form is new versus returning within each activity type. So for those of you that are let's say operate an emergency shelter with ESG funding, and you have a street outreach program that you are looking to get funded through ESG, you will be a returning applicant for emergency shelter and a new applicant for street outreach. Now, in years past, that meant submitting two different applications, a renewal application for emergency shelter and a new application for street outreach. You don't have to do that this year. However, that's going to bring up new complications. So let me try to tease it out, okay? So you can submit one project application form. It will have an agency section and it will have the program type sections. Within those program types, you can select new or renewal, but the corresponding materials that you will need to submit for new applications versus renewal programs are different. So here's where I really want to dive in on this section so that you know what to submit if you are applying for new funding versus returning funding, okay? Again, this is in the instructions, but here we are, so let's talk about it. So I have this section of the webinar structured into all project applications, new project applications, and returning project applications. So as you might assume, all project applications refer to all project applications. When I then say new applications, it'll be in addition to all the things listed under all project applications. Does that make sense? So there are certain things that both renewal and new applicants and entire agencies need to submit. Those are the things that every program needs to do. There are additional things you will need to submit if you are applying for new funding, or additional things you will need to submit if you're applying for returning funding. So I'm going to break that down for you. So what we're starting with is what you need to submit if no matter what you're applying for, new versus renewal. Okay, so the consolidated project application form. This is what is written by the ESG office themselves. I didn't write it. It is on their website to find and download. We will give you those links. And it's in the instructions as well. And again, there is a section in your consolidated project application form that is for the agency as a whole and then per project type. And you can select new versus renewal for each one of those projects. Okay. You also need one project budget form. This is broken into tabs. It's an Excel document, and each tab is by project type with a summary tab for your whole agency. You only need to submit one of those, but you do need to submit it in Excel format. We need policies and procedures. Again, I mentioned this already, but now we need policies and procedures for each program type that you're applying for. If you think about it, I'm not going to know how you run a street outreach program by reading your emergency shelter policies. So you need the first two items I mentioned is one for your whole application. Policies and procedures need to be for each program activity type that you're applying for. Uh-oh, got a broken link, Brian. Okay, continuing with all project applications, you need to include, now this is new this year, y'all. We have included and created a supplemental information form. This is specifically looking to provide context for how agencies are thinking about racial equity and in incorporating the perspectives of persons with lived experience of homelessness. This mirrors the folks that are applying for CoC funding, different program, different funding competition, but same setup here. So some of your neighbors may be applying for this as well. So it is not, I didn't just make these questions up out of a hat. They are being used on a different scorecard, but it is new to you. So once again, our ESG page on our website under the current application dropdown, we'll have a link for the supplemental information form. You only need to do this one form per entire agency, and please fill it out and then save as a PDF to include in your materials. You will need a form or a Word document or a chart for your board of directors. I think I miswrote this as a header because I thought the ESG office was going to have a form that you would download from their website, but it does not seem like that was their intention, so they've given instructions. Now, this is what I have here as well. So it includes name, contact info, their board position, / leadership team, their term, occupation, or representing agency, their race, gender, whether they have lived experience of homelessness, and their professional skills. So we need an organizational chart for your board, and you can submit that in a Word document. One more detailed note on the supplemental information form. Now remember, this is the new form that's available at the NCCEH website. It is specifically collected by the CoC. This is not actually something that the ESG office is requiring. They do have racial equity questions in the program application. You will need to respond to those as well. But this is additional and supplemental information. So it's worth noting that you will need to submit that for the CoC. Should you be approved for funding through the CoC, you actually won't need to include it in your final document submission to the ESG office. This is for internal process based on the balance of states, priorities to impact racial equity. And it is on our ESG, the NCCEH's website under on their ESG application page. Okay, so remember, everything we just said is for all project applications, no matter if you're new, no matter if you're renewing. Now, in addition to those, if you are applying for a returning activity, let's say this is the second, third, fourth, 20th year you've applied for ESG funding, you will need to include an HMIS annual performance report. Now, this is new, y'all. We have required CAPER reports in the past. But as we look to increase our ability to incorporate performance as a measurable component of an ESG competition and ESG applicants, we are asking you to submit an APR this year. Especially if you work for a DV agency and you're having red flags go up all over the place in your brain saying, I've never run an APR before. That's okay, we know that. We know that particularly DV agencies have not had to run an APR before. This may be a new process for you. If it is, and especially if you are not the database person for your agency, please take a look at the link that Brian just put in the chat and contact your database person quickly. If you work for a DV agency, particularly that is, if you are a renewal funder, then you should have a database that is considered a comparable database and should be able to run an APR. You should have this capacity. You may just not have been asked to do it. If you have questions about running an APR through HMIS, you can contact the NCCEH Data Center, and their email address is hmis@ncceh.org. We really want you to, if you have questions, if you're freaking out about how to run an APR and you want the data center's support on this, we understand that the entirety of the grant timeline is pretty short. Please do not wait until the last minute to email the data center for help in how to run an APR. They cannot guarantee that they will get back to you in time if you submit a question regarding how to run an APR after August the 8th. Please prioritize this if you are having to do some reaching out and some information finding on how to do that. I would send that email sooner rather than later. But take a look at the guide first and see if you can figure it out. Oh yeah, it's also worth noting that this is a requirement of the CoC. Again, like the supplemental information form, we are trying to create priorities that help us in our goals of coordination and our goals of implementing best practices and improving performance. The ESG office will require a caper. I am sorry that it seems like I am making this more complicated than you may think it needs to be. So do note the CoC, APR for the CoC. Oh, that sounds like a chant. APR for the CoC, but then caper for the ESG. Don't worry about the caper report now. Work on the APR, send that with your submission packet to NCCEH. We will be giving you instructions if you are approved for funding as to what reports and information you will then need to compile to submit to the ESG office. For right now, focus on the APR and focus on the dates of July the 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. Okay. In addition, now remember for returning activities, if this is not your first time getting ESG funding, you will then also need to include a corrective action plan if you have one. If you don't have a corrective action plan or you don't know what I'm talking about, this probably doesn't apply to you. But if you've been working with the ESG office, if you've had things identified by them that y'all need to change or work on, and you've created a plan with them, you need to include that in your funding packet as well. Please submit that as a PDF. And that can be for calendar 2021 or 2022. So we want to look back a couple years. Okay. So then in addition to what we said for all project applications, let's switch and talk. So that's it for returning. What we listed for all applications plus these additional ones for returning applications only. However, if you're a new applicant, you again need to submit everything we listed in the list for all project applications, like the budget form, the application itself, the board information form, the policies and procedures, and in addition to all that, you will need to submit your current year's operating budget for the entire organization, including revenues and expenditures. You need to demonstrate your finances are in a place to be able to operate an ESG grant, which is a reimbursement-based grant. It is worth noting that if you are new to ESG, that this is a reimbursement-based grant and you will need the a cash flow to be able to operate your programs up front. And while you submit requisitions for reimbursement from the ESG office, so if you're newly applying, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have that capacity, as well as an organizational chart for your entire agency, including the staff that have any responsibilities for the proposed ESG funded projects. So we want to get a sense of your staff capacity. Okay, so is your head spinning? So let's go back to the situation, the example that's a little bit more complicated. So if you're just applying for a new street outreach program, that's pretty simple. You're doing the documents that are listed under all program applicants and the ones listed under new activities. But let's say What do you need to submit if you are submitting a, let's say you're submitting a renewal application for emergency shelter and you've got that street outreach program you've been building and you're ready to apply for ESG funds to really solidify that program and run with it. What do you need to submit? You need to submit one consolidated project application form with fully completed sections for both emergency shelter and street outreach. You need to submit one project budget form with fully completed sections for emergency shelter and street outreach. You need to submit one balance of state CoC supplemental information form. You need to submit one board of directors information form. You need to submit two policies and procedures documents, one for your emergency shelter program and one for your street outreach program. You do need to submit an HMIS APR for your emergency shelter program from July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. You then do need to submit your current year's operating budget for the entire organization as well, based on the needs of applying for a new street outreach program. And you do need to submit your organizational chart for the entire agency. Clear as mud? Okay. Where do you go to do this? First answer is it's in the instructions. Again, please keep the instructions document handy. It has this link in it. I would actually even ask Brian that you don't put this link in the chat right now because I think it's best to have folks like reference your instructions document to be able to find this link when you are ready to begin uploading, to upload your documents and complete the form. And of course, August the 12th is that deadline. Please make sure that all of your applications with all of the materials fully completed, well thought out, are submitted by 6 p.m. on Friday the 12th. Then, okay, so then one final note before we get to Q&A. I'm so happy at how we are doing on time, but maybe I went too fast. I'm not sure. If you've been approved, it is really important to note. Once again, you'll be notified on September 13th if you've been approved by the CoC to submit your application to the ESG office for funding because they contract with you. They have a very different list of supporting materials to include. And I'm sorry, because saying that just makes it sound so much more complicated. I really want to focus right now on what is needed for this initial application, which is why we focus the entire webinar on this August the 12th deadline and what you need to do and compile for that August the 12th deadline. But do note, for those of you who have been approved, that the ESG office has a longer and different list of supporting materials outside the project application form and budget form. There are some things that are the same and there are some things that are different, and there's a lot more of them. You can find that. It's called their attachment checklist. That is as a last page of the consolidated project application form. So essentially just know that your window between September 13th, when you're notified, let's say if you're notified that you're approved for funding on September 13th, and the final submission deadline window deadline on October 3rd, that window of time is going to mean compiling a different set of documents. It's pretty straightforward stuff on there, and but it's different ones and it's longer. Okay. What questions do you have? that is all the content I have for you. Again, I would urge you to visit the website at ncceh.org/BOS/ESG and find all the materials there, including the instructions and the supplemental information form. And you can always email the balance of state at bos@ncceh.org with any questions. I'd like to keep the recording on for a minute, as I think y'all's questions may really benefit people who may be watching this recorded. But it does not record chat. So if you have a question and you don't want to be heard on a recording, you can put something in chat and I won't say your name if you want to do that, or I will turn off the recording a bit later and you can ask your question then. What questions do y'all have? Are we required to submit a program manual by 8/12/22? Yes, you need established written policies and procedures for each application time. They must be included with that submission by the August 12th deadline. Thanks for that question. Someone was just coming off chat. Go ahead. Yes, for new applicants. Oh, I know y'all have more questions than this. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording. Before I do, oh, that is such a good question. I really appreciate this question. There's a question in the chat that asks, is this for any population of people? Thank you so much for asking that, because I really should have put that on slide 1. These are for agencies that specifically serve people who are experiencing homelessness according to the HUD's definition of homelessness. And those agencies will likely need to verify homelessness in order for their clients to be eligible for services. HUD's definition of homelessness is literally homeless, is within a 14-day window of being literally homeless, meaning sleeping outside, sleeping in a car, sleeping under a bridge, in a tent, somewhere not meant for human habitation at all. Or someone who is fleeing domestic violence or sexual assault. So yes, it is a very specific population of people, and I'm so grateful to you for asking that question. If you do not serve people who are specifically experiencing homelessness, you may not be eligible for these funds. I will put that at the top of the webinar next time. Human trafficking likely fits within category 4 of the HUD's definition of homelessness for folks who are fleeing domestic violence and is eligible. What is street outreach? That I could give a whole other webinar on. I would encourage you first to start with the written standards that kind of help guide program designs that are available on our website. I will find the link for that. Essentially, street outreach is a program that is meeting people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness for folks who are sleeping outside or sleeping in tents or in cars, experiencing homelessness outside the context of an emergency shelter. Street outreach is a program that can provide services and coordination and transportation and support to those folks who are living unsheltered so that they can access housing services and shelter supports. That's a very brief overview. So it's meeting people literally where they are and providing services to people experiencing homelessness. To clarify, this is not reimbursable funding. Lanisi, I'm not sure about the, maybe I'm missing something about your question. ESG funding is a reimbursement-based grant. Essentially, if you are approved for ESG funding, you will submit monthly requisitions for the money you have spent out, and they will reimburse you for those funds for all the services and operations funds that are eligible under that grant program. So they do reimburse you. Depending on how fast you can make requisitions happen, it can be as late, I think at least I was saying as late as like 75 days later. So you need a decent cash flow. That's a great question. If you serve multiple balance of state regions, do we or can we apply to each region? And if so, will it also be 2 applications to ESG Department of Health and Human Services? I don't know how to do it any other way based on the regional fair share. If you provide services in multiple regions, because the funding is so specific to each region, you would need your application considered within each region's fair share. So for the COC's process, I can't really see a way around having to submit it twice for that purpose. I don't know what that would mean for submitting it to ESG in terms of just like the paperwork, but I can find that out. That's a great question.
Laurel, they would have to apply separately per region.
With ESG's, which is with the ESG office too?
Yeah, so with ESG, they would have to apply separately per region. Once it's contracted, it will be contracted in one pot.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Right. Okay, I'm seeing the questions slow a little bit, so I am going to stop the recording, but y'all stay on the line and keep asking questions. If you are watching this as a recording, thank you all so much for being here. The contact information is on your screen. Please do reach out. Please, well, first, please read the instructions for your ESG application. And then if you have questions beyond what is in there, please reach out. I'm just kidding, reach out anyway. But good luck. We will talk to you soon.